In a white paper titled China and the World Trade Organization, China said it will continue to open up in a more comprehensive, profound and diversified way. The document outlines China's achievements since joining the World Trade Organization in 2001. Those achievements include boosting world economic recovery and growth, reducing import tariffs and opening the services market.
The country's WTO entry 17 years ago set off continuous improvement in the living standards of the Chinese people, rapid economic growth, and more importantly, the accelerated integration of the commercial interests of China and the rest of the world.
Well, there is lots to talk about. For more on China's commitment to the World Trade Organization, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Portland, Oregon is Liang. She's an associate professor of economics at Willamette University. From Montreal, Chen Zhao is a founding partner and chief global strategist for Alpine Macro. Here in the studio is Jeff Moon. He's an international trade and government affairs consultant. And from Boston, Joel Trachtman is a professor of international law at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Liang, let me start with you. So China has released this white paper detailing its commitment to the WTO and the obligations therein. Question is, why do you think China released the paper? What was the motive behind it, and why now?
Well, I think in this 27 pages white paper, as you said, first time since 2001 that China released, China tries to deliver three main messages. One is, like you mentioned, it tried to show its commitment to the WTO accession. And second is to showcase China's contribution to global economy and global trade. And lastly, I think a relatively more subtle message is to really emphasize the legitimacy of the WTO as a transnational organization in governing global trade and investment and settle any trade disputes. So I think at this juncture, China released this paper on the one hand to show that China has been making commitments to fulfill, the WTO conditions, and second is really to condemn the United States' unilateral decision of imposing tariffs on China's exports.
Chen Zhao, this is what the Chinese Vice Commerce Minister Wang Shouwen had to say when that paper was released. Let's watch.
In terms of trade in goods, China promised to reduce the average tariff level from 15.3% to 9.8%. This goal was reached in 2010. In the service sector, we are required to open 100 sectors. Now, over 120 sectors are open to foreign countries.
So, Chen Zhao, do you think this will satisfy critics who've long complained that certain sectors of the Chinese economy have been closed off for foreign investors?
I don't think it makes a huge difference at all. I think the first thing first, you have to realize the fact that the Trump's very hawkish attitude towards China started with his anti-establishment bias. Right now, he's much more interested in talking to his political base than really to think about a cohesive trade policy towards China. Because the problem right now is that his political base really loves what he does towards China and the EU. And he will continue to play that card, despite of the fact that the Chinese government has expressed its willingness to compromise and to accommodate American needs. It doesn't matter. It is a completely political, and to us, to me, it sounds completely irrational and completely way out of whack with reality, but it doesn't matter. It works for him. It works for him politically, and he will continue to do that. So I personally do not believe this white paper will do anything to persuade him to change tack or to even change the public opinion in the United States, because right now, both left and right consider China as a bad guy, quote unquote bad guy, so they want just trying to play tough. So that's my opinion. I don't agree with their approach. I think it's completely wrong, it's irrational, but nonetheless, that is a political reality that we have to deal with. The Chinese government need to be prepared for some very tough actions that will be taken by the White House. That's my take anyway.
Well, Chen Zhao, do you think these actions will be taken? Because if, as you say, this is political in nature, Is what we're hearing from the United States more of a negotiating tactic rather than something of substance or policies of substance that are going to be implemented?
Well, the problem here is that I don't know whether you have read or seen Steve Bannon's interview with Fareed Zakaria recently.
I have, yes.
He laid out his case very clearly. He's very much into this so-called economic nationalism. Basically saying that everything has to be American first. In their view, in Trump's view, that the whole world trade system was constructed since the end of the Second World War by the United States with the Soviet Union, in mind. In other words, the U.S. basically was giving up a lot of its right and to take care of its little brothers in Europe,
right.
And for that matter, for China too, since the 80s, with one single goal in mind, which is to fend off the Soviet Union. Now, with the Soviet Union collapsed, to them, the whole trade system need to be recalibrated. There is no need for Americans, in their view, to subsidize the rest of the world anymore. That's why he wanted to renegotiate, recalibrate the whole world trade system from ground zero. That's where the problem is. I don't agree with their view, but okay. That's their philosophy.
Jeff, this is what part of the white paper says. It says, and I'm quoting here, economic globalization has powered global growth and is an irreversible trend of our times. China and the multilateral trading system stand together through thick and thin. What's your view on what was in that white paper?
Well, I think the white paper rightly takes credit for a lot of measures China has taken since it joined the WTO, because China has done a lot of things and made contributions. Yeah. However, I think that there are a number of things that are missing from the white paper. Things that come to mind are, one is philosophical, one is more practical. From the philosophical side, China was admitted to the WTO with the assumption that it would adopt reforms to make it a more market-based economy. WTO is a market-based organization. All the members are market-based. China has not done that. It still has a state-led economy with 5-year plans, targets, favored companies, and that's important because it disadvantages foreign competitors, and that's one of the things that the Trump administration is raising. There are also specific WTO commitments that China has really not honored, and here the best example in the current context is forced technology transfer. Chinese officials use opaque regulatory environment with many different kinds of approvals and hoops that people need to jump through in order to extract technology from foreign countries. And that's not only inappropriate under WTO, but China has pledged many times not to do that. So those are among the things that I think are behind some of the foreign criticism.
There was another list that was released by China, Jeff, in which it announced further opening in the sectors that it said it would further open its economy: finance, transportation, professional services, energy, agriculture, energy as well. So it is moving in the direction in which it says it wants to, right?
It is, but having been involved in many negotiations with Chinese officials, there are promises and re-promises and re-promises. There are frequently market announcements that all of them are prospective in the white paper as far as I can see. And frequently, after market openings are announced, there are in addition other approvals, once somebody actually tries to approve to get in, other approvals that they have to go through, causing delay and perhaps an inability to get into that market.
All right, let me bring in Joel Trachtman. He's in Boston. Joel, thanks for joining us. Now, the white paper is an effort, in part, by China to show that it's in full compliance with the WTO accession, with the obligations that it has to meet. How important is that, not just for China, but for its trading partners, too?
Well, I think that China's trading partners are well aware of China's record, which is a good record. It's not an unusually good record, but a good record. China is, in many ways, a normal WTO member in that it complies. Sometimes it doesn't comply in areas that Jeff Moon has mentioned, but also in areas like export restrictions on raw materials and a number of other areas. But when China loses a WTO lawsuit, it generally has come into compliance, and it's a good citizen at the WTO. I think the fundamental issue that the United States and the European Union and other trading partners are concerned about is the one that Jeff Moon put his finger on, and that is that the pace of reform in China has not been as rapid as was expected at the time that the WTO accession of China was negotiated. And there are still important roles for state-owned enterprises, for the party, and for the government in controlling the economy. And that undermines some of the market opening commitments and some of the commitments not to engage in export subsidization that are in the WTO. And that's the kernel of the valid concerns that the United States has about the WTO. I also agree with Mr. Chen that the way that the United States is now pursuing those concerns is not rational and consists of self-destructive behavior in a number of dimensions.
Yeah, it was a question I had, because if the pace of change is not as rapid as the United States would like, if the United States wants that to be accelerated, I mean, is the imposition of tariffs the way to go?
Well, it really depends on how China responds. And, this is Trump's art of the deal. He thinks that by imposing these tariffs beginning on July 6th, he'll induce a response of simple acceptance of his positions. I think that's unlikely and will result in something that will be difficult to handle and that the world will have to eventually back down from, but there'll be a lot of damage in the short term.
Young Liang, I was wondering if you could address the point that Jeff Moon raises about forced technology transfer. It's a very contentious issue between the United States and China.
Right. I think there are three important points to know about this accusation. The first point is that China has always been following the WTO rules, and their position has been if there's hard evidence that shows the forced technological transfer or intellectual property theft, this should be brought to WTO, and China will follow up and it will accept any sort of resolution from the WTO. Where the United States has been making accusations without hard evidence, this is not acceptable from China's point of view. And also, based on some industrial leaders' comments, that it is a win-win situation in some cases where they trade technology for market access. So this is the first point. The second point is China is still a developing nation, and it's never promised to abandon its socialist market system. In other words, China will pursue industrial policy, and the government will play a critical role in subsidizing some strategic industries and supporting technological improvements and progress. So I think just by accusing that China is committing property theft would not really stop China from improving and supporting its technological progress. And then I think the last point is that there are many other more effective approaches to improving and protecting intellectual property rights. A blanket imposition of tariff on China's exports, it's not the effective approach.